Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. This is your final session before lunch. So don't worry, we will keep you fed and watered very, very soon indeed. We're moving on to our next roundtable with these gentlemen here. It is about financing football clubs. Pasamos a la próxima mesa, la financiación de clubes de fútbol. So here's the question. How do you finance and manage the finances of football clubs? It is a complex question. It's an important one, especially in this age of financial fair play, with clubs dealing with that with varying levels of success, I would say. So let's find out more now with our next guest. Descubramos más sobre este tema con nuestros próximos invitados. Our moderator, Andrea Sartori, Global Head of Sports at KPMG, and with him, Jason Traub from 23CAPITAL, who are very kindly our partners for this particular discussion. We also have Hector from Cuatrecasas and Domingos Oliveira, the CEO of Benfica. Please give them a warm round of applause. Andrea, over to you.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you to our three speakers. As you can see, we don't have a uniform dress code. And today we're going to talk about financing in football, or in very simple terms, we're going to talk about money in football. And we're going to start with a question for Jason, just to set a little bit the scene. And I would like to ask Jason to describe a little bit the third-party landscape, the financing landscape, who are actually the players, the role of traditional banks versus special lenders, the difference in different geographies, and maybe it could also be quite interesting, you can start with that, explaining a little bit the type of services that 23CAPITAL is actually providing, because it's quite unique.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Andrea. 23CAPITAL is a funding and solutions business to the sports, music, and entertainment sectors. So, those are our forte. We saw, my background having really built a financing division within a bank, a traditional bank in London, we saw that really in order to add true value into those markets, you needed a dedicated balance sheet that actually understood these risks and understood that they were risks that typically were very difficult for traditional lenders to make sense of. So that's how we set up 23. We provide financing across the capital stack. What does that mean? We lend money as typical to a mortgage, senior financing. We lend more difficult second lien financing, and even have some form of equity offering. So that's ourselves. As far as the market goes, I think one of the principles that has certainly made sense to me was, from the very beginning, it was important for everybody to make sense that typical financing, typical financiers, whether they were banks, funds, pension companies, insurance companies, at the end of the day, they look at risk exactly the same way. They look at risk whether it was a mortgage, whether it was an SME, a small, middle-sized company, or whether it was a football club. And so one had to truly understand, what it was that those parties needed to see. So, direct answer to your question, it's a very disparate market. There are banks who are trying to make sense of that, locally and more international focused. There are funds who have always seen that as an opportunity. And then hopefully, there are more, as you will see with ourselves, specialist finance companies that are dedicated to making sense of this space.
But in terms of geographies, if you take, of course, the UK being probably a more advanced type of financing market where you see a lot of clubs with profitable, stable cash flow, I can imagine that there are many more players than you would see, for example, on the Italian market, on the Turkish market, and maybe some other leagues to which you want to refer to.
That's right. But I think everybody would be surprised at how that gap isn't that large. Even UK great Premier League clubs don't have, I don't believe, the same exposure to the financial markets that a similar sized company in a different sector would have. And again, it's no magic. That's because the underlying risk within football, when you put intangible assets and cash flows, something that banks struggle with. They can't market to market. They have to hold full capital against it. They can't sell at that risk tomorrow. Whether it's because their assets on a football club are typically intangible, it's the stadium which is difficult to finance, or players that hold true value within that club. Very difficult to finance. So actually, what you find is you have easy financings. So in the UK, overdrafts, which we all take for granted, you know, some of the great banks that we'll all understand, if that's the right phrase, they'll put in an overdraft because they don't have to think very hard for a Premier League club at a certain level. Everybody can just buy into that risk, as opposed to truly understanding and providing a structure that can drive value to your client.
Mm-hmm. Hector, let me ask you, especially for the Spanish market, have you noticed that somehow the risk appetite of bank has, let's say, decreased? Do they consider somehow the risk of financing football club decreasing? Do you see more players interested in financing football club? And do you also noticing a decrease of the cost of debt provided to, cost of financing provided to football clubs?
Well, I think the Spanish market, football market, is as Jason mentioned, is based on funds and specialized lenders rather than banks. I think banks, they still play some role with some of the clubs, but they left, I would say, to a certain extent, the Spanish football market a while ago. I would dare to say even before the crisis. So this is very much a fund market now, and I think in terms of costs, prices are going down because there's a low interest environment and there's a lot of liquidity around. But still, I think this is not gonna drag the banks in easily, because to me the real barrier to entry for this market is what Jason was mentioning: the flexibility, the accelerated pace of innovation that we can find in structures. The way that football clubs are very special, categories, animals of their own. So you really need to factor in a lot of creativity when structuring a deal, and this is something where I think funds and specialized lenders are much more prepared to tackle these type of challenges than banks, which follow a more standardized approach to finance.
May I ask you, having seen many financing contract, what is the typical cost of financing, for example, discounting receivable in Spain for a very major club regularly playing in the Champions League or in the Europa League? So let's take Real Madrid, Barcelona, Atletico Madrid, Villarreal, versus a small, medium size. What is the difference in margin?
Well, I won't talk about figures because I guess,
but you are independent. It's not independent. It's selling financing. You're not selling financing. That's why I'm asking you.
I could say, trying to be objective here, I could say there is a gap. There's a clear spread gap between the big clubs and the smaller and medium ones. Probably if you ask the clubs, they would all tell you that it's too high for the market environment we have now. But when you see it with some perspective, you see that first there is availability of funds to clubs that were not there, had no access to the lenders market only a few years ago. That is a big improvement. There's also some impact on prices, as you were asking, but I think the big difference so far, comparing to previous years, is more about the access to capital and the different span of solutions you can find as a borrower, rather than strictly speaking on the spreads, which factor in many different aspects beyond what is the cost of capital in the market at present.
Jason, do you want to give us a number, just to give an indication to the audience?
I'll try to be independent. Spreads certainly, if I go back 4 years ago, and I'm sure Domingos will be able to ratify this. 4 years ago, spreads were around 8% for, nobody got out of bed for less than 8% to discount a transfer, 4, 5, 6 years, unless you were one of the very top clubs, which is why that number probably doesn't make sense to you, Domingos. We've certainly seen those spreads come down without question, and that's come down to anywhere from 4 to 6.5 as the central. Now, you'll have exceptions to all of that. I think to Hector's point, the true value has been for vanilla credit, for vanilla risk, where you don't have to think hard. If it's a 1-year football transfer that people are discounting, or a 1-year broadcast deal, you have many more entrants to that market who have a lower cost of capital. The bigger banks can get their head around that. because they don't have to have such depth of knowledge and expertise and focus within the market, and so they will price that accordingly. And so that's driving the spreads.
And what would be the difference in spread between the cost of financing for a very well-established club and the club that, let's say, is subject to the risk of relegation, for example?
I'll tell you what I've seen in the market. Hector can tell you. I've seen anything as low as 3 point something, but one shouldn't get too attached to those numbers.
Yeah.
And I've seen as high as 10, 11%. I don't know, Hector.
Yeah, I agree.
Very interesting, thank you. Domingos, let's come to Benfica. So how the financing strategy, let's say, how is the current financing strategy of Benfica and how it has changed over the past 5 years?
Well, I'll give you an answer with a little bit more time, with 15 years, okay?
Okay.
We built our stadium 15 years ago, and the only mechanism we were using to finance the stadium was through a project finance. That was typically the case where the Portuguese banks were supporting the Portuguese clubs, and things went from this situation to until 2014, where we had this big crisis, and the Portuguese banks were no longer able to support any Portuguese clubs. So it was a big difficulty for all Portuguese clubs to face this situation where suddenly your biggest lender was no longer available to support you. So in the meantime, we went from this situation working mainly with the banks, and not only the Portuguese banks, to a situation where today we use different types of products. I would say the main one is public bonds. So we went on a market where we issue a new public bond every 3 years, every year with a maturity of 3 years. We use companies like 23CAPITAL for very specific deals. And in fact, we have a very peculiar situation where we don't have any longer any specific relation with the Portuguese banks. So we reimburse all our debt to the banks, and now we don't use the typical and the classical banks in financing Benfica. So big changes in the last, I would say, 5 years, due specifically to the crisis with not only the Portuguese banks. We try to work with foreign banks, but they still see the football industry as a risky situation. They don't know the business, so every time that we discuss with banks in London or in Frankfurt, for them it's extremely difficult to understand the business.
But is it really riskier than other industries? I mean, if you look at your financial, also looking at your player trading results, and we will get back at a later stage of this discussion, all in all, you have a pretty stable cash flow. So I struggle sometimes to understand why lenders, they are actually considering the industry so much riskier in comparison to other. So I would like to hear your opinion, and then also Jason, what do you think about that?
Well, the business is quite stable, as you mentioned. We have contracts like TV rights contracts signed for a period of 10 years. Okay, we have the players trading that we have today. It's quite important,
yeah.
And it's the same in terms of figures for the last 6-7 years. So people know in terms of revenues what they can expect from Benfica. So you're right. I think you're right. I think that we are able to work with companies who know us and who know the business, and they are ready to lend us money. Okay, but it depends on the complexity of what we show in terms of delivering, not in the pitch, but outside the pitch. And for the last, just to give you our example, for the last 5 years, I would say that we generate more than 100 million in terms of profit, net profit. And this gives you the stability that companies like 23CAPITAL, they are looking in a club. Now, there are other clubs, and I could talk about other Portuguese clubs, but I will not do that, who the situation is a little bit more difficult. So it depends on the trust, it depends, I would say, on the management side also, it depends on the way you present your forecast, it depends on the track that you show that you have done in the last, let's say, 5 years.
Jason?
Yes, agreed. So there's a lot of that speaks to those fundamental principles again: strength of management, strength of presentation, the financial acumen, and their how good is the reporting, all those things that you would see in other sectors, and for the main part, they are, in this day and age, similar. to other sectors. There's a lot of complexity to that question. Relegation alone. Banks have no idea how to make sense of a revenue projection over 3-4 years that can make sense of relegation. And in truth, that meant everybody looked at 1-year risk, which is what the market had been built around for the last 15, 20 years. We certainly are trying to and have done a number of deals 5, 6, 7, 8 years long, but we look at risk in a very different way. Relegation will confuse the good and the great of the banking credit committees, because ultimately there is an executive committee that oversees all of those sectors that don't have the insight and the strength of understanding into all the moving parts. And even if you did have that, relegation is difficult. And what that really means is, okay, what other assets are there to contra that? And hence why for 23Capital, making sense of how well that club is run and managed, such that in the event of relegation, okay, 3 clubs go down and up every year. Why are we all, in hysteria around that risk, if you understand it? 2, playing squad, the value of players, their ability to trade, that's liquidity for a club.
Yep.
How tangible is that market? How can you rely on that market? To ask a credit committee to make sense of that is very difficult.
I actually feel that there is the tendency to consider the industry as risky as a whole. However, within the industry, within individual leagues, there is a huge difference between clubs playing at the top of the league and clubs playing at the bottom. And Hector, I made this comment basically to also ask you, how can you actually manage the risk of a low sporting performance, which can be a relegation case, which of course can be very, very painful from a financial perspective, but not only that, for example, if you would take certain clubs like Italian clubs, German clubs, not qualifying, for example, for the Champions League, it would have a significant impact on their financial. In the UK, with the overall revenue coming from national broadcasting, to a certain extent, the impact is limited. We have actually seen this on Manchester United. So how can you actually contractually mitigate the risk of a sport performance that is not what it was actually expected?
Well, there is no single standard solution because every situation is different. I think relegation has always been a challenge technically to how to face relegation risk and how to factor that into a financing. But these days, I think we have solutions for that. As Jason mentioned, it's about having a holistic view of the club to see what other assets they can offer to the lender and how easy it is to roll over security over those assets if relegation comes in. This is not always so automatic. I mean, you have to do some brainstorming there, but at some point you can set up a structure where the cash that you are not going to receive because you are relegated is somehow compensated from a security point of view with the compensation payments that you could get from relegation as well. It obviously has to have some compensation payments, but there are ways to face that, technically. And in terms of the other impacts that it has, I think it basically has an impact on the size of the financing. This is the main challenge of relegation these days. Not about setting up a bankable structure. It's about reaching the size of the financing that the club is expecting from the lender. And this is really, an example. Champions League qualification would be another one. But at the end of the day, it's about not following a single pattern, and that's why I come back to my argument about banks earlier before. You have to think of a transaction as a standalone transaction and try to figure out it from scratch.
While you were giving the answer, something came to my mind. Is it mezzanine used to finance a football club? Could that be a way, in a way, to mitigate that risk?
In a way, mezzanine is always present because every lender is actually adjusting the security to first what the club can offer, and second, the position of the other lenders. So to a certain extent, everyone is subordinated to someone else, and everyone is senior to the others to a certain extent as well. because at the end of the day, football financing remains largely asset-based financing rather than balance sheet or EBITDA-based, other than certain, very large and well recognized clubs where the situation might be more conventional and look more like the other industries.
And the issue with mezzanine, obviously, one of pricing.
Yeah.
But equally, it doesn't sit, and Domingos will be able to reflect this much better, it doesn't sit well often within club strategy, because is it equity, and how do you get that back? If it's reliant on cash flow, and people are prepared to take that risk, and typically mezzanine funders, okay, well that's a much higher cost of capital, they are more aggressive, but then ultimately the issue of relegation is a binary one in many people's minds. Well, if you can't repay, then they're really taking sporting risk. And that's something that financiers on principle will often shy away from. Benfica potentially might be in something of a unique position, because I think we have bigger problems if you're a relegation risk.
Well, we don't, of course, we don't foresee any problem in terms of relegation to a club like Benfica. But as you mentioned before, I think that going through the qualifying rounds that we went in the last couple of weeks for achieving, attending the Champions League group phase is a big difference being there or not being there. The difference in Champions League for us, for Benfica, is 42 million euros being in, and eventually 5 or less being out. So there's a risk there, but as you mentioned, it depends a lot on the cash flows. When we prepared the budget this year, we didn't count on going on the Champions League, because the figure is so big for a club like ours that you should not depend on that in order to deliver what you're supposed to deliver. So the fact that we are now in the Champions League gives us a bonus, but for example, for lenders, this does not present a risk, because we have forecasted everything without going in the Champions League phase.
Absolutely. Jason, can you describe which are the typical financing issue that a big club is actually facing and a small club is facing, and how can you actually help, especially the smaller club, to actually grow through a certain financing strategy that you can suggest?
Yes, of course. So the bigger clubs, and again, potentially speaks to relegation, the bigger clubs have access to more sophisticated, have visibility through to, for example, the USA and the financings that happen there. And I remember this time last year, there was a gent on a panel with me from a very large American institution, banking institution, who was looking to come and do an awful lot more of stadium finance here in Europe, and is looking to do that. And the difficulty being that in the US, they have a very different model. Being able to finance the stadium, it's a piece of entertainment. I can speak from my own experience only, but when you go to an NBA game, for example, it is it's a moment and 3 hours entertainment. I'm not sure the sport is more or less important than everything around it. And of course, there's no relegation. And so that speaks to a sophistication of financing that is very well developed. Now, a lot of the clubs in Europe, the larger ones, are seeing that, are understanding that. Manchester United being able to list and take advantage of those markets. Insurance companies, pension funds in America who are looking to assume more risk into these markets. And they're trying to make sense of that issue. And in some ways they are, if you can try and diminish the relegation risk. Smaller clubs don't have that sophistication, or certainly that visibility. Sophistication they still have, and hopefully that is something that we can bring. But again, no magic. Well-run clubs, and Domingos speaks to a strategy of not including Champions League. That statement alone is relatively rare, and I understand why. So many clubs will want to believe that they're going to perform better and push on and are confident and excited about that season, and sometimes don't focus on that downside financial management and making sense of what it looks like under scenario 2. And to the extent that strong management, strong financial control does reflect that, there is good sophistication. And like I said, perhaps not in the same way as the Benficas and Man U's and the like, and Real Madrid's, Barcelona's, but certainly, much more exciting financing opportunities that can assist in the growth of that business beyond traditional one-year banking lines, for example.
Hector, what about corporate bonds, and also crowdfunding is coming to my mind, which seems to become quite popular, is also a way to get the funds involved, especially on the Spanish market. How do you see that?
Well, there's a lot of noise around that, but to be honest, very few transactions so far. I think we're still at an earlier stage than corporate bonds, at least in the Spanish market. Crowdfunding is there, but the problem about crowdfunding is size and is access to information, which is not so easy, through a crowdfunding structure when we're talking about a football club. I think that these days the real hot spot is about off-balance financing. More and more clubs are looking forward to having the access to structures where the financing is off balance, non-recourse. This is really having an impact on the way you structure the deal and on the documentation as well. It's not possible in all cases to have this structure. Will depend very much on the strength of the club and the quality of the underlying assets. But I would say that we're more working on this rather than on the bond market, at least when it comes to Spain, for the time being. Although there's been some discussions and some clubs have actually tried to tamper the capital markets, but I don't think we have many success stories so far.
By the way, can you describe a bit the typical documentation that is actually requested by a lender when preparing an application? I don't know if you want to distinguish between senior loan and discount of receivable, which are, let's say, the most classic area on which clubs are actually focusing.
Well, as a finance lawyer, I find it football quite fun because there's not a template conditioned market.
Yeah.
In other industries, you have LMA standards, you have LSTA standards. Here, because of the nature of clubs, the fact that each of them is a species of its own, there's no so much dependency on templates, and that makes it more interesting. Having said that, as I said before, there is a big red line, which is whether or not the financing is going to be recourse or non-recourse, whether it's going to be off balance or on balance. That's one thing. The other thing is whether it's going to be balance sheet based or asset based. We have overrepresentation of receivables and factoring structures in the football market. It's mainly, as Jason mentioned, short term, but we also have some long-term financing with different documentation approach that would be a standard banking approach in other industries. For example, in terms of representations and warranties, in terms of covenants, clubs are fairly reluctant to give covenants on performance, on management decisions. They don't want to assume any liability or to be restricted in the management decisions in the future, capex, investment, budgets, even information beyond what is there disclosable. I think there's a big difference there. And
sorry, Hector, that spoke to your beginning question of, why isn't it like other sectors? Well, a traditional lender would have all of those covenants as given, and yet, and understandably so, many football clubs feel constrained by, I don't even want to give you the information, let alone restrictions around investment into balance sheet.
I actually think that the industry needs to be educated. For whatever reason, it's only in the last 4 to 5 years that somehow football clubs, they start to be treated as real enterprises. So there is an overall perception of risk associated to the industry, which personally I don't think is anymore justified in many, many cases. If you take the top 30, 40 European clubs, either by enterprise value or by turnover, these are quite stable enterprises. Some of them not, but many of them, they have pretty stable cash flow. So I don't actually see the reason why, to a certain extent, the financing industry is getting more involved and is starting to understand better the risk return profile that the football industry is actually providing.
There is one element, I would say, which is history. I mean, the track record.
Yeah.
We are not coming out of a sudden, and obviously in some countries, Spain is one example, we have a history of a lot of bankruptcies around football clubs. Actually, we had, in the first decade of this century, we had more than 1/3 of first division clubs that went down at some point. And I think we cannot alienate ourselves from that track record when it comes to how the industry is approaching lending.
Yeah, and that's actually open up somehow the next question, which is actually related to financial fair play. And I want to ask two questions. The first one to Domingos. So I want to ask whether or not financial fair play has actually fostered third-party financing. And then I would like to ask Jason for the Premier League and Hector for La Liga, whether or not the national financial fair play has been an obstacle or has actually fostered third-party financing. But let's start with the European financial fair play.
Well, financial fair play, we are now in version 2.0, and I think that the results coming from the fact that the clubs had to deal with financial fair play since, I think, 2013 or something like that, the results are extremely good. I think it was a great success, not only coming from UEFA, but also from the European Club Association, that I'm a board member. The fact that we work together with UEFA, you saw the results. I think the results are public in terms of financial fair play. The majority, the big majority of the European clubs have today a good situation in terms of not only about just P&L, but also in terms of assets, in terms of delivering information. And you're right, I think that the clubs were not used to deliver proper information, and they have now tools, different tools, where they do that. For companies like ours, who are listed companies, that's much more easy because we have to deliver so much information during the year that it's easy. But financial fair play helped us, all clubs, to deliver more information on something that you can see the improvement, and the results are there. Now, in terms of what did this help to third-party lenders, I think that the results, the fact that the clubs have today a better situation in terms of balance sheet, in terms of P&L, helps a lot, of course, these gentlemen, in order to support the clubs, because the situation is no longer as risky as it was 10 years ago. So the results are there.
I fully agree. So,
Yes.
Jason, is the Premier League in a way supportive of third-party finance, or are they trying somehow to...
To be clear, third-party finance is an independent arm's-length financing as opposed to the non-recourse third-party investment, which obviously FIFA, that's a different issue that isn't allowed in football. It's a good question. It's about alignment with the regulator and the regulating body. Personally, no. The Premier League has often felt that its success should be sufficient for the strength of underlying football clubs to survive without financing. And that has been, philosophically, I understand that approach. And in fact, perhaps if you go to Germany, you see much more of as well, that social, the importance of football as a social part of the fabric. And you can't own beyond 50% of that club, and financing in the same way, challenge. But you have to weigh that up with sporting progress. I'm not, the guardian of that principle. Whereas I know La Liga, for example, are doing a great job of, really putting a framework, speaks to financial fair play, and actually it does raise another point around, you speak about the landscape, access to capital markets, financing in general. The regulators have a big role to play, and not just the clubs that are doing what they're doing to improve and drive forward and stability, but a lot of the third-party financial institutions, pension funds in the USA, for example, look at the regulators, and it's the system of financial fair play which is starting to build integrity across, which is important, as opposed to previous, perhaps, where it was too easy to look and say, well, who's looking after the guardians, and so forth.
Hector, how is the situation in La Liga? Although Jason has somehow anticipated
I think
the major difference.
I think that the Liga are fostering a lot and giving a lot of confidence to lenders. They're playing a great role. They have basically two roles. First, they are kind of financial watchdog of clubs, performing a monitoring role, which is now quite settled. And the second aspect where they are very useful is about contrasting information. For example, when you are creating security over broadcasting rights, over players' rights, La Liga is perfect match in terms of knowing whether or not that asset is free of every prior liens, whether it's free for additional lending, what is the level of coverage of that club in terms of security as opposed to debt. All that information, the Liga is very proactive there, and it's actually giving a lot of comfort to specialized lenders.
We are speaking about financing and we are speaking about third-party financing, but having you here, having the CEO of Benfica, I cannot avoid to ask a question related to your financing capability through player trading activities. You are a first-class example of a European club who has been able to finance themselves outside of the traditional source of revenue being commercial, broadcasting, and stadium. We launched a study last year in September in which we prove that looking at the financial statements of the previous 2 football seasons, Benfica was the #1 club in Europe. And Domingos, can you a little bit describe how you made your club so successful with player trading, a little bit the activities of your wonderful academy?
Well, the reason why we invested so much in the academy and in players trading is because the size of the Portuguese market is what it is. When I joined the club, our total revenues were close to 45 million euros. And at the time, the biggest clubs in Europe were close to 200 plus, let's say between 200 and 300. So the difference was quite big, and the Portuguese market in terms of development was too small. So, and where we ended this season for sure, we will deliver more than 300 million euros between normal revenues, like you mentioned before, and players trading. And the reason why I invest so much in players trading is because in terms of sponsorship, in terms of gate entrance, and in terms of TV rights, there's a limit in the Portuguese market. So we had to find additional sources of revenues. Players trading is one. The second one is something that we are starting to develop now, which is going abroad and launching our own operations in different geographies. But let's go to players trading. We have, in fact, very good results in terms of not only the academy, but also in hiring players from outside our geography, nurturing them, and trying to put them in the market with a potential extra in terms of money from the one we paid. I think it's a combination of different things that we do in the academy. The first one, of course, is scouting. Scouting is extremely important. Not scouting when they are already 25 or 23 years old, but scouting when they are 12, 13, 14, and I think we have a very good team for that. The second one is the quality of the coaching that we have inside Benfica. We pay extremely attention to the coaches that we have, and in fact, part of our development outside Portugal will be through the coach that we have and the possibility of having these activities done outside Portugal. And the third one is the possibility of having these players playing at the most difficult level they can. So it can be second division because we have a B team, it can be outside Portugal, it can be in a small team in Portugal, or it can be in the first team. Just to give you an example, we had a match yesterday that we won, and the first goal was scored by a young player who is 18 years old. Two years ago, he was playing in the academy, no one knew him. So it's a full strategy where you have to deliver a certain result, and the club is totally committed with this strategy.
Clear. Jason, I have a question for you which is related more to the evolution of the European football market after the introduction of financial fair play. So UEFA has just reported that football clubs made in the football season 16-17 600 million profit in comparison to losses of about 1.7 billion in 2011 when financial fair play was actually introduced. We see a lot of clubs, especially in the UK, where somehow satisfying shareholders and creating shareholder value is becoming is basically the primary goal. But how can you, in an environment like that, in a way, keep the fans happy? And looking, for example, at clubs like United, clubs like Arsenal, which are enormously successful from a financial perspective, how can you actually manage your fans' expectations?
Oof. How long do we?
I know it's a tough one.
That's a difficult one. And I think it speaks to this is a much bigger strategic issue, and one that I think Benfica have clearly done extremely well over the decades, to your point, Domingos, because perhaps you have had to, being in a much smaller market. But shareholders have, if you speak about a company in a different sector, have many tools available to them, and how they can drive value, and then how they can exit, and how they can take value. And that is misaligned entirely in many cases with fans who aren't looking to see a shareholder pay himself dividends without looking to see, raising finance in order to drive value that leaves the club. It goes back to tribal, social, kind of philosophical principles that make this very difficult. For the bigger clubs, it's a little easier. I think Man U is a wonderful study where they went and raised an awful lot of finance at a time where they had none, put a huge amount of debt on the balance sheet. We all, kind of the independents who were looking at that carefully went, whoa, if this doesn't go well, this will be interesting. And ultimately, their performance did drop off. Their financial results at the time struggled a bit, but they're such a powerhouse. They were able to see through that, and since then, commercialization and the growth of broadcasting has softened it. So difficult.
Maybe just one last comment from Domingos on managing the need to, in a way, achieve certain financial results in order to respect what the regulators are asking for, and managing the fans' expectation, considering, of course, the history of your club and how successful you have been on the international scene for the past many decades. How difficult is that?
Well, I'll give you my personal experience. It took me some years to understand in this industry, because I was not coming from this industry, to understand what the stakeholders were looking for. And I'll give you this example. Very often I went to a bank. I thought I would talk with the banker of Benfica, and in fact the same person, after 10 minutes, he was asking me questions about the squad and about the result we had in the previous weekend, etc. So you start with the Benfica banker, and very suddenly you discuss with the Benfiquista from the bank, okay? So the level of emotions that are associated with this business are quite high. And I think it depends a lot on you in order to deliver the results that you think are the right ones, more than what the stakeholders are asking for. We always say that we cannot be the perfect loser. Perfect loser means that you are perfect because you deliver to the shareholders what they expect in terms of return on investment, but by the end of the day, you don't win. And I think that you have to understand that the industry is different from any other industry. Or you're first, or you're one of the others. And in the big clubs, and you mentioned Man United, Arsenal, outside, those two clubs are very typical clubs in the EPL. I think that what the fans expect is that they deliver in the pitch and off the pitch. And I think that there might be a huge struggle between what are the expectations from the stakeholders and what are the expectations from the fans. And that's the beauty of this game, is that you have to try to make the mix between.
Combine. Yeah. Thank you very much. I see you're impatient to ask a question, right?
Well, I am, because I know you had a final question to Domingos, but can I have a final question?
Of course,
Is that okay?
of course.
As soon as you're here, and admittedly, si me permiten, la última pregunta, and doing this, wearing three different hats, if you like. So here is the host of the stage, but also as a presenter of Sky Sports, who of course are a broadcaster with rights deals in the UK, but also as a fan. So how do we see the growth of TV broadcasting revenue holding up, or is it going to increase? Is it going to maintain itself? Is it going to plateau? And how does that differ between the Premier League and La Liga? You guys can discuss it between you very briefly, if possible. Jason, you first.
I'm perhaps least qualified on this to answer that. I'm sure you guys will have a view. It clearly feels like the growth and pace of growth in the more traditional, the Premier League, for example, is under some pressure, but everybody is standing there waiting to see what happens with the new entrants, new media. What are Amazon, what are Facebook? and new platforms that we are seeing, and that's very exciting. It doesn't have to be Amazon and Facebook. You know, disaggregation of the rights can drive great value for many new entrants. I think in some of the smaller leagues, the opportunity to grow continues. But yes, that's just personal view.
I personally believe that the Premier League has more or less plateaued, while I think other leagues are possibly, they have the opportunity to grow, but I do actually personally believe that there is a major risk that everyone will actually decrease, because we have a limited stock of leisure time that we can spend on a daily basis and during the weekend. We all have other commitments, family commitment, responsibilities, and the reality that there are new, let's say, activities, leisure activities coming up on the market, starting from e-sport, which are going to draw away actually consumers. So I wouldn't be surprised that in 15, 20 years, the overall pie will actually decrease rather than increasing.
Okay. Hector, Domingos, anything to add?
No.
You're happy?
Well, I just wanted to make the point about disaggregation. I think the growth, as you were mentioning, I think we've reached more or less a plateau. But you know, the challenge now is about creating more value about through the segregation rather than grossly.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you. Well, talking about leisure time, we don't want to eat into your leisure time, or indeed, this is a very hungry auditorium, and I know that they want to break for lunch. But nevertheless, please once again give a huge round of applause to our speakers. Fuerte aplauso para nuestros ponentes, Andrea Sartori, Jason Traub, Hector Bros, and Domingos Oliveira. Thank you very much indeed, gentlemen.